Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Ginny, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C.
First of all, we need to downsize the department. It's no longer an experiment to have a department. We know the track record since 1980, and the experiment has failed. So it is time, as we keep saying, to correct Carter's mistake and actually, ideally, eliminate the agency. I fully recognize what a gargantuan task that would be, but we have a better opportunity now than we've had since it was created.
President Trump has pledged to return education to the states and directed recently confirmed Secretary of Education Linda McMahon to put herself out of a job by shutting down the Department of Education. Members of Congress will play a big role in that process, and they've started holding hearings to determine their next steps. Lindsey Burke of the Heritage Foundation and I recently testified before a U.S. House Labor HHS Education Appropriation subcommittee hearing. The hearing focused on how pouring more federal funding into a fundamentally broken and unionized system will not help our nation's K-12 education improve. In our opening statements and throughout the hearing, Dr. Burke and I addressed the failed history of federal education funding and the nation's abysmal student outcomes, even after the federal government provided $190 billion in supplemental COVID-era funding. We had exposed the union's harmful role, we dispelled misconceptions about education freedom, and in today's episode, we reflect on that hearing and some of the most frustrating claims made that day. Dr. Burke is the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. She's a member of the Board of Visitors for George Mason University and the advisory board of the University of Austin's Center for Education and Public Service. She's also a fellow at EdChoice. Lindsey Burke, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thanks for having me.
You and I testified before the House Appropriations Labor HHS Education Subcommittee in a hearing that was originally called More Federal Funding Isn't the Solution for K-12 Schools, but then was renamed Federal Investments in Elementary Education. You and I went in and said what we had to say about our concerns about federal funding. And so I thought it would be helpful to today go over some of the main points that we made in that hearing. And then while we're in that hearing, you and I got a little frustrated by some of the things, the claims that were being made. So now's our opportunity to respond to some of those concerns that we had about myths and straight up lies that were put out there during the hearing. So how does that sound to you?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I actually didn't know that the name of the hearing had changed. So in my written testimony, it's got the old title, More Federal Spending is Not the Answer, which it is not the answer. And we know that from decades and decades of spending and lackluster results.
Yeah, for sure. I love the original title. I changed my title at the last minute when I logged in to find the link to send to my mom right before the hearing started. I'm like, oh, they changed the name.
It's the most important part of any testimony is finding the link to send to your mom. So obligatory for all witnesses.
Yes. Yeah. We got to have one viewer for sure. Actually, I think that there was quite a lot of interest in the hearing. You and I were expressing surprise by how packed the room was. Yeah. And that's good. Let's engage. Let's talk about this. And let's address the fact that federal education funding has been considerable over a long period of time, and the outcomes are abysmal. And so those were kind of the main points in my testimony. We were each given 5 minutes of time to give opening remarks, and I wanted to make it very clear that I actually worked for a member of that subcommittee decades ago in the late 1990s. That was my first job out of graduate school. At the time, the NAEP scores, the Nation's Report Card scores in reading and math, were higher than they are now. So we've spent a lot of money since I was on the Hill all those long years ago. And all the people who came knocking on my door as an appropriations legislative assistant and Approps LA saying, just give us more money. We'll fix all the problems. They got their wish. They got more money. Yep. They got more federally funded jobs, and students did not get what they deserved, which was rich academic experiences, expanded educational opportunities, and even basic skills in reading and math. And so as I went through my remarks, I made the point that in the recent Nation's Report Card or NAEP scores, we have about 30% of students testing proficient in math and reading at 4th and 8th grade. Alarmingly, and we have 40% who aren't even testing at the below basic in some of those subjects and grades. So a higher percentage who do not have basic math and reading skills than the percentage of students who are considered proficient. So we have an undeclared crisis in education in this country, and we have a status quo that's absolutely unacceptable.
We have more children who are functionally illiterate than who can read proficiently.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable. And it's been unbelievable for a long time, right? You get fined every time you mention a nation at risk, right? But I'll pay the $1 fine and mention, this has been going on for a long time. We've known about this since not only a nation at risk, but well before that, right? The Coleman Report and all of the previous assessments of lackluster educational outcomes. And we also know that spending has made absolutely no difference. And to add to your list of groups who have benefited from ever increasing federal spending on education, which, by the way, has increased education spending throughout the 20th century, 3.5% per pupil per year, every year throughout the 20th century. But the other group's the teachers union, right? I mean, we know that increased federal spending, increased education spending in general, has accrued to their bottom line. That they have, and Ben Scafferty's work on this is excellent, of course, but they made a conscious decision to put this additional money in more staff, not in, say, paying teachers more. We could probably agree that there are some really good teachers out there who do deserve to be paid more. But no, the union said, we're not going to prioritize teacher pay. We're going to prioritize more staff, more both administrative staff and just non-teaching staff generally. And we see it in the data, right? 100% increase in the number of students since the 70s, but a 243% increase in the number of teachers. That's a lot. Until you hear there's a 709% increase in the number of non-teaching staff. 709% increase. And so clearly the unions prioritize putting the money there because it accrues, again, to their bottom line. More staff means more dues paying members, and that's their modus operandi.
Lindsey, what was the ratio that you gave of
1-to-1. So it was, if you go back to 1950, there were 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher in school districts across America. Today, it's 1-to-1. So for your typical American school district, for every teacher you see, there is a non-teaching administrative counterpart. And I mentioned that in the hearing, and one of the members, forget who it was, might have been Eddie Harris, Representative Harris, but said, in response, well, what is the exact proportion or percentage of teachers in the classroom today? And if you look at the most recent NCES data, it's 47.5% of all K-12 education staff are actually teachers. So I think that speaks volumes to our priorities when it comes to education spending and probably contributes to the lack of efficacy in ever increasing federal spending in particular. And by the way, one more thing on that. We have yet to be released data, so breaking news here, from our Center for Data Analysis that looks at the impact of education spending in the K-12 realm, local, state, and federal. They actually find some correlation between local spending and academic outcomes, less correlation between state spending and academic outcomes, and negative correlation, meaning the more the feds are spending, the less we're getting in terms of academic outcomes. So the farther away you put the spending from the student, the less of an effect. And in fact, at the federal level, potentially a negative effect it has on student learning outcomes.
Lindsey, that's really important analysis. So thank you for sharing that.
I mean, on them to publish it.
Yeah, we will look forward to exploring that more. So you really dug into these numbers, the percentages, the changes over time. Yeah. I emphasized the fact that at each level, as Title I and IDEA, the big pots of federal education funding flow down from the feds to the states to the districts. Each level of government takes a cut.
Yes.
So we've got that aspect of it, and then each level of government adds more burdensome regulations, monitoring requirements that eat up staff, and they eat up staff at the state level. So you have a significant chunk of SEAs dedicated to just filling out forms that nobody ever looks at and submitting them to the federal government. and it eats up staff resources and time at the district level as well, which means that those low-income students from low-income families, when you're talking about Title I, and students with disabilities, when you're talking about IDEA, they're not being served. All those adults in the system that you're talking about are busy with monitoring and compliance and paperwork. They're not busy on focusing on student outcomes and serving students and meeting their needs. So these are highly complex, highly burdensome programs that take away the attention from the people closest to the students, and that's a problem.
We nerded out over the Crossroads report a little bit before the hearing because you were kind of there in the trenches when that report was being produced and published, and it's my favorite ed policy report. Everybody's got one, right? But Education at a Crossroads, it really is great because there are a lot of reasons that report's great. It's comprehensive and it really gets to the heart of the problems with federal spending. And that's the only report that I'm aware of that has the dollars to the classroom figure in it, where they found that 65 cents, just 65 cents on every federal dollar makes its way back to the classroom. And so, you just think, okay, if we were going to set up an education system tomorrow, would we set it up like this at all, where we take from local taxpayers, parents and grandparents and local communities and force them to send that money to Washington and filter it through the bureaucracy at the department and then send them back 65 cents to the classroom and think somehow that will improve educational outcomes? Like, it's no wonder that hasn't worked. But, it's one of the, I think, key findings of that Crossroads report. And I highlighted a little bit of it at the hearing because it is such a seminal report that I think maybe has gotten lost over the years. But it did all of the federal spending that has accumulated over the years since 1965 did really create this, quote, program for every problem mentality that they outline in the report. And, in terms of the effect of the federal spending, like the actual effect has been that it's created this shadow state level Department of Education system, right? All of these little departments of ed at the state level mirroring, Jenny, to your point, what the federal department's doing, and that there are 3 times as many federally funded employees in state agencies as at the federal Department of Ed. This is something Jonathan Butcher on our team looked at a while ago, and he found something like 40 plus cents on every dollar in state salaries for state education agency employees is federally funded. So, huge issues there with this sort of shadow state level departments of ed. But the line that I find so interesting from that report is that they were able to document, the Goodling Commission, how federal spending had created this, quote, cottage industry in selling information on program descriptions, on application deadlines and filing instructions for each of these myriad federal programs. So that ended up requiring, and still does, millions of man hours every year. I think, in fact, they found it was 25 million man hours every year just to complete the federal paperwork burden. And yeah, to your point, Jenny, this is why all of this money is getting siphoned off the top, such that we only end up with 65 cents on every dollar, ultimately making it back to the classroom.
Yeah, and that was in the late 1990s. Yeah. So imagine what it is now when things are more complex, more burdensome. There's more reporting requirements, and people from all political people from across the political spectrum will acknowledge that Title I in its current form isn't working. It is too complex. The formulas do not target funding to truly low-income students. We've got a system that's just broken in so many ways. So love that you bring up the Education at a Crossroads report. Let's keep that alive and bring out that spaghetti chart that Congressman Hoekstra and others used back in the day to show how there are so many tentacles to what the federal government is doing with education, and then therefore so many opportunities to streamline, devolve, simplify what's going on. I think we both concluded that pouring more federal funding into a fundamentally broken and union-controlled K-12 system is not the solution. What did you propose for solutions?
Yeah, so a few. First of all, we need to downsize the department. It's no longer an experiment to have a department. We know the track record since 1980, and the experiment has failed. So it is time, as we keep saying, to correct Carter's mistake and actually ideally eliminate the agency. I fully recognize what a gargantuan task that would be, but we have a better opportunity now than we've had since it was created. If not now, I don't know when it's going to happen. And so that should be the goal, is winding down that department, moving the handful of programs that are appropriate at the federal level, that are unique in their purposes, and that are actually effective to other more appropriate receiving agencies. So IDEA over to HHS, data collection over to Commerce, Census Bureau, Title I over to HHS. I mean, there's student loans to Treasury. So for those programs that would be retained, at least in the near term, moving them over to more appropriate receiving agencies. So that's sort of the big goal or big recommendation that I made. But we also have to stop the education spending spree, this tripling, inflation-adjusted tripling of federal, state, and local for that matter, but all combined, it's a tripling of per pupil expenditures. Again, has just led to this staffing surge that hasn't served students well. And we need to give states more control over how they spend their dollars. So with the money that's there, block grant that money back to the states. And just, in case there are any savvy listeners thinking about, well, are there inconsistencies where we might not want to block grant something like, say, welfare, but block granting education funding makes sense? That's because federal education funding is such a small component of overall education spending on K-12 ed, right? It's less than 10%, maybe a little over 10% now. And so it makes sense to send that 10% back to the states and localities who are already financing 90% of what we spend on K-12 and allow them to assume management responsibility for that funding.
I think sometimes people hear the word block grant and then their critical thinking or their mind just switches off. Like, I don't know, that seems like too big of a task. But one thing that I'm hoping that people understand is that, okay, we've got Title I and we've got IDEA, but we also have this like mismatch of little, like there's been a proliferation of these little competitive grant processes that eat up a lot of resources at the U.S. Department of Education, at the state level, at the district level, and consolidating those little pots and then making it easier to just apply for a pot of money that you can use
at a minimum. Yeah. I would go further and say eliminate all of those little competitive grant programs. We have, again, decades of evidence that they have not improved outcomes whatsoever for the groups that they're supposed to help. They're just inappropriate too at the federal level. So our recommendation has long been eliminate all of the competitive grant programs, and for those large remaining formula-funded programs, to give that management responsibility to the states, move them to other agencies, block grant that funding.
Block granting can consolidate what exists. It also could be consolidating what's left. If Congress is at all open to eliminating programs. But something that both you and I think we're trying to make it clear is that the appropriators, they're not victims of Doge, of Elon Musk, of President Trump. They are the appropriators. Yeah. So when they were kind of trying to, I think, ask us questions to kind of trick us a little bit. I did want to remind them, like, you guys are the appropriators. Mm-hmm. So when you claim that like IDEA hasn't been fully funded, well, that's on you. Like, that's what the appropriator's job is to do, to determine the level of funding. And then when you're talking about cuts, that's decisions that you guys are making with each other in Congress, because the Appropriations Committee sets these levels of funding. One big thing that I think didn't come up in that is that the appropriations has soared for Title I specifically. You're talking like over a $2 billion jump in recent years. So when there are attempts to get things back to maybe the 2019 pre-pandemic levels with Title I, it's going to be, this is devastating. These cuts are terrible. Or maybe it's just kind of right-sizing things a little bit, because there were these huge jumps during recent years. Okay, so somebody who might be tossing around the word devastating and cuts and all that was one of our fellow witnesses. I believe his name was Robert Kim from the Education Law Center. And actually, he said that drop in funds would be devastating. And the same goes for every member of Congress. He was talking about how much funding the members there would lose and how that would impact the students in their districts. Do you think that any sort of adjustment in levels of appropriations for federal education would be devastating for students?
No. And in fact, surprise, no, I don't. In fact, I think we should look at how state-based school choice programs are funded as a good example of why that wouldn't be the case. I mean, look at Arizona, right? Look at the ESA program, which is near and dear to all of our hearts in Arizona. This program is giving 90% of just the state money, right? So no local dollars, no federal dollars to families in the state. And families are saying, you know what? Even though that is just a portion of the overall per pupil spending, that's worth it to us to be able to go to a school that meets our needs and aligns with our values and is actually a good fit and is safe and is effective. Oh, and by the way, I can find schools that check all of those boxes at a fraction of what the government schools are spending. You know, it doesn't prove per se that government spending is at the right level or not at the right level, but it is highly suggestive that when parents can control those dollars, they're able to find options that are the right fit at the right price point. So this idea that we need to continually increase education spending or that cuts to federal spending would somehow be devastating, it's just not supported by the reality that we see on the ground when families actually have control over their dollars.
Well, he did mention those school choice programs. He said that the negative fiscal effects of vouchers are huge and have accelerated. Trends stretch state budgets to the max and threaten the ability to maintain high quality public schools. Thoughts on that?
It's curious because we find exactly the opposite, particularly in states like Arizona. There was a shoddy analysis done and then a better reanalysis done of the fiscal effect of the ESA program in Arizona. And lo and behold, it actually saved the state money. Surprise, surprise. And look, this is something that states are going to have to really think about over the next decade. There is we've talked about this before, but demographic cliff that's coming that is going to impact states' bottom line. By the way, far more than any modest school choice programs would ever do. And these same people, if I could just go on a bit of a tear for a second, you know, nobody complains really about public school choice, right? I mean, in fact, the Democrat members in that hearing said, oh, we're all about school choice as long as you choose a government school, right? I mean, so even they have said, okay, we're cool with public school choice. Well, if you have robust public school choice, technically that's draining money, quote, draining money from whatever assigned public school. If you choose to go from your assigned, quote, neighborhood school to another public school, that money is leaving your assigned public school and following you to another school. It's just staying within that public pot of money. Mm-hmm. If they were so concerned about that, they would also say, you know what? Once you buy a house somewhere in a state, you're never allowed to move again. Because anytime you move, that money is going to follow from your public school to wherever you move, out of state, within state. And so, you know, they're Chicken Little, right? They always say the sky's falling when it comes to school choice programs, but we have much more existential, I don't want to say threats, just issues facing K-12 spending. And that's largely demographic in nature, right? As we see more and more boomers retiring. Ladner's got the exact number, Matt Ladner, off the top of his head, but, you know, it's like thousands of them retiring every day. I think it's 10,000 a day from now until 2030, roughly that. And the net effect is you have more people riding in the cart than pushing it, right? You have more people who are utilizing public services than are in their prime working years. And so that will have an impact on state education budgets, which typically are the second largest component or spending item in a state budget following healthcare. So if states want to think about a way to save money, how to be a little more fiscally prudent in the years to come, they should move towards school choice options where kids and taxpayers get a better bang for their buck. And it's just icing on the cake that it also saves a little bit of money in addition to being good public policy.
That demographic cliff is something that you and I are trying to draw awareness to. I had a Freedom to Learn podcast conversation with Marguerite Rosa. Yeah. You and I co-hosted an event with Marguerite Rosa from the Genomics Lab at Georgetown University. She makes it very clear that families stopped having as many kids after 2008. So there are fewer students who were born and who are therefore going through the K-12 system. You and I are both board members on universities. The higher ed community we talk about it all the time, right? The demographic cliff, because universities are going to close because there aren't as many students. K-12 is practically silent on this. So schools are going to close because there aren't as many students. It is a reality. It's something that happens over time regularly. Yeah. My big concern is that individuals who don't like the idea of education freedom are going to say that vouchers did this. No, the fact that there aren't as many babies who were born starting in 2008 did this. No. So that demographic cliff is something that people should I
want to say too, though, that all of that is absolutely correct. And we've talked about this in various fora over the past couple of years. But even if schools closed as a result of school choice, right, which we haven't seen happen yet, but why would that be the case? It would only be the case if enough families said this particular brick and mortar building isn't serving my family as well as this other school is or education opportunity is. And so the only reason schools would close is if they're not meeting the needs of families and local communities. If they are, fantastic, right? And again, even in states with universal choice, we have not seen this massive we haven't seen any school closures actually that I'm aware of as a result of choice options. We have seen competitive pressure on public schools, encouraging them to perform better and to meet the needs of families. But we've seen yard signs pop up and billboards in states like Florida advertising public schools, saying, come to our public school, don't go to that one. I mean, that's amazing, right? So we've seen everything that we had hoped and anticipated we would see, which is when you bring a little bit of market discipline to a sector that has been effectively a monopoly, we actually see things improve.
We did try to bring the good news of school choice and education freedom to the hearing. The members of Congress did have various things to say. I would say that the Republicans kind of surprised me in their portion of the question and answer session. They know what's up. They know that there's great news out there when it comes
Shout out to Riley Moore, Congressman Moore from West Virginia.
Yeah, talk a little bit about what we heard from him.
Yeah, I mean, he's long been a fantastic proponent of school choice as treasurer in West Virginia prior to coming to Washington, but has just been at the forefront of advancing what is one of the most pioneering education choice programs in the country, in West Virginia becoming among the first states to do a universal ESA. So amazing now to have him in Congress and being a supporter of advancing education freedom for families. So it was great to see him there and to hear him continue to spread the good news of school choice.
Yeah. And then across the board, we had members from Louisiana, from Georgia, from Oklahoma, even from Maryland saying, we know that expanding education options is the path forward. And we know we need to return education as much as possible to the states and make sure we've got transparency and flexibility. It was very encouraging to hear those members who seem to be informed on what's going on and excited. Yeah. So on the other side of the aisle, we had a number of members make comments that you and I kind of jotted on our little notes, our notepad. Hang on. We have concerns about that. I just found this at the bottom of my bag. And I'm trying to remember some of the things that got us fired up. But I remember Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin. I mentioned in my testimony that 2% of Black students in Milwaukee are proficient in, I think it's math. And I looked at him at the time and he had kind of a neutral expression, which I think that's shocking and deeply upsetting. He, in his remarks, was expressing concerns about the Milwaukee school choice program. And I thought, why do you want to trap students in these schools that are failing? So did you have any sort of reactions like that where you're like, hey, I said this one thing and you're saying something that shows that we're talking past each other?
Clean up your own house first, right? The public system is a mess. It is objectively failing generations of children, particularly in Milwaukee, right? I mean, if you look at we have the TUDA, right? The Trial Urban District Assessment. At least I think it's still kicking after some of the cut. But if TUDA gives you information on district level data for, at a minimum, the 25 largest, it might be a little more school districts in the country. And so Milwaukee is in that. And yeah, I mean, it's among the worst, if not the worst, depending on the year, performer, particularly for low income and minority students. I mean, it's been a terrible story for a very long time. If I think bang for his buck, he could get a lot more out of actually focusing on cleaning up the public system, the grip that the unions have on that state and that district, and at a minimum, giving those families some opportunities. That, the Milwaukee Parental School Choice Program has expanded over the years. That's been a lifeline for the kids who can participate. But we are seeing, and you know this well, a shift in how the movement, and I think just supporters generally of school choice, think about these programs that, absolutely the kids who are the least well served by the district assigned system need an exit pass. But we need to make these programs universal so that they are politically viable long term. Yeah. If you make it universal, you give everybody the opportunity to participate. Therefore, everybody has a stake in it. And when you do that, you make it not unlike Social Security in the way that it functions, right? That and this is not a love fest for Social Security by any stretch of the imagination, but just in terms of how it functions, right? Everybody is sort of implicated in it and therefore has something to say about it. With school choice, this is a lesson learned, right? To move from these smaller targeted programs that get the ire of the Representative Pokins of the world and to move toward universal options where everybody can participate and it creates stability, political stability long term.
I was upset at the end of the hearing. There was a congressman, I think his name was Congressman Josh Harder, I believe he's from California, who was talking about the importance of protecting IDEA, seemingly as it is, and seeming to equate the funding for outcomes for students. And I'd mentioned in my written testimony that I had a child with an IEP. I cried in my car after every meeting. Something that I think people should know is that the latest NAEP results have students with disabilities who are tested at 70% below basic. So we're not dealing with a system that serves students well. I did mention in my spoken remarks that funding, that $14 billion from the federal government, fuels a bureaucratic nightmare, a labyrinth that families have to navigate, and many of them have to sue in order to receive services and accommodations. So this idea that we have to protect IDEA as it is was upsetting. The other thing that I'd love for you to address was his claim that a recent House vote on a budget resolution was going to impact IDEA funding. I found that so cruel, to speak frankly.
It was. And you whispered, I think at some point, like, why are they sitting here trying to scare parents? Yeah. Which is exactly what was happening. First of all, the budget resolution, it's just instructions to Congress, right? With like a high level number, which sounded high. And we went back and forth on this, the member and I. And by the way, like I hadn't read it just came out before we testified, right? I hadn't read through the whole thing. But I was confident in saying there's no way it affects IDEA funding. For one thing, as we move through ultimately, this was just the budget aspect of it, but as we ultimately move through reconciliation over the next few months, anything in reconciliation is going to have to be mandatory spending. IDEA funding is not mandatory spending. But second, these, again, are just instructions to somehow find $300+ billion. I say somehow, it should be very easy because it's over a 10-year period at the Department of Ed to cut. And so most likely where we're going to see that play out is things like the PLUS loan program in higher ed, eliminating some of the sort of leftover student loan forgiveness nonsense. It's still built to some of these student loan programs, competitive grant programs at the K-12 level. You mentioned it could be something there, but this idea that somehow they're going to cut spending for special education,
that's the first priority,
right? It's like, when there have been government shutdowns in the past, and what do? They say, we've got to shut down the parks, right? So that when a family shows up to a national park, they're like, oh my gosh, like I feel the pain, or that it's going to somehow affect payments to Social Security or fill in the blank program. I mean, this is not happening in the budget resolution, and yet that's where these members went, as to your point, a scare tactic for families who are so underserved by the existing IDEA structure. And I'm glad you brought this up because I completely understand why families of children with special needs have concerns when they hear conservatives say, we want to wind down the Department of Ed or downsize it, because they may think that that's where the protections come from, the Department of Ed. But in fact, everybody should know that the Individuals for All Handicapped Children Act, that came in 1975, right? So the protections in law for children with special needs would not go anywhere. The funding for IDEA would not go anywhere in any of the proposals that we've seen. It simply gets managed by HHS as it used to, instead of by the Department of Ed. So just if there are any families of kids with special needs who are listening, know that those protections remain, the funding remains. And ultimately, what we would love to see happen is that those families actually have more control directing how those funds are spent. So if their public school wasn't serving them or providing them the education to which they are in fact entitled under federal law, that they could leverage some of that money to get private tutors or to get special ed services and therapies, occupational therapy, whatever it is that they might want to purchase. So more power to the parents in that dynamic, less power to the bureaucrats in the process to get in between families and the services to which they're entitled.
Yeah, and less power to the lawyers who right now have to get involved in too many cases in order to ensure that those students are served and receive the federally promised accommodations. Let's take the lawyers out. Let's just let's make this an easier process for families who are already really struggling and for vulnerable students who really deserve the best when it comes to educational options. Any other things that came up during the hearing that you'd want to address?
I mean, I was just mad the whole time because there were so many, I think it said at one point, there are just so many myths. Somewhere I too have a piece of paper where I jotted down angry thoughts during the hearing to respond to. But, it's always the case, but it felt particularly the case this time around with myths that were being promulgated during the hearing by people who know better in a lot of instances. And, this idea that somehow school choice is going to segregate students, that came up as well. That was thrown out by a member. Utterly untrue, unsupported in all of the data on all of the programs. If anything, school choice integrates schools rather than segregates them. Continual misinformation on the impact of federal spending over time, looking to shoddy research that is p-hacked and not on solid empirical ground to make their claim, rather than what we know to be true after half a century. By the way, this is the 60-year, half a century plus, 60-year anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, when we get almost all of the federal ed programs pre-K through the HEA. So, 60 years on, we know from, I'll borrow a term from the left, our lived experiences, that federal education spending's failed. And we need to try something different. And that means downsizing and right-sizing. And for the money that remains, putting it in the hands of families to choose schools that work for them.
Absolutely. Well, Lindsey, it was an honor to testify with you when we had that opportunity. And I appreciate our partnership as we do try to ensure that families are informed, that families are empowered with options, and that myths are addressed. We're not going to have it.
And you were brilliant, Jenny. I'll just say to close that my favorite part of the hearing was your line where you said, a germ did not cause NAEP scores to decline. Like, that's right. It was the teachers' unions, school closures long after we knew it was safe to reopen. That's what caused NAEP scores to decline.
So well done. Thank you for that. That was in the Q&A when you're like winging it, but I did want to make sure.
Wing it.
Yeah, I did winging it and hoping the adrenaline will kick in. But thank you. But Lindsey Burke, thank you for your commitment to education, freedom, and parental rights. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thanks for having me.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.